to esteemed guests, Dr. Nadia Hashimi, and my best friend, Dr. Zulkifli Ahmad, and my teacher. We're happy that we are basically able to have Dr. Nadia Hashimi over here and without any problems, like what we had with Professor Mohsen Kadewa before. And we're going to discuss about this very interesting topic about what is political Islam all about, and secularism as well. The first topic, the first basically forum is on political Islam versus secularism. Now we have main proponent of political Islam, Dr. Zulkifli Ahmad, with us, and Dr. Nadia Hashimi, as mentioned by the chairperson just now, Yuan Mei Wong, is an author of a very famous book, Islam, Secularism, and Liberal Democracy, right? And I think it's a very interesting book, and we're going to have a discussion on that book, a reading session on Sunday tomorrow afternoon. The morning was basically the roundtable discussion with Dr. Zul as well on Islam, post-Islamism, and civil Islam. Oh no, that one is the second session on the secular, the religion and secular. Yeah, that's the reading session tomorrow. Well, before I start, I'd like to give a little bit of a brief definition about. Probably some of you might not be aware of what is meant by political Islam. Everybody, I think, perhaps will have his own ideas about what political Islam is all about. I would say that there is no exact definition of what political Islam is. What is clear is that it is a composite of diverse movements with the same belief that Islam has a built-in political system and that all Muslims are required by their religion to follow this system. So I would briefly describe it as that. Right? These movements can be global and seeking to establish a global Islamic caliphate such as Hizb ut-Tahrir, which, like recent article said, was a precursor of ISIS or ISIL or Islamic State, or country specific seeking to establish an Islamic State such as Islamic Party PAS of Malaysia, or in Pakistan we have the Jamaat Islami. And it has, irrespective of their different background, one thing in common is that the main aim is to establish some kind of Islamic polity, which then can become an instrument for global Islamic resurgence and even political unification. I also believe that Islamic polities, Islamic states or caliphates are not the end game, but they are to become means and instruments for a global Islamic resurgence. After briefly talking about the definition of political Islam, what now is secularism? As most of us, if not all, are aware that the root name of secularism is from the Latin word of seculum, means age in a temporal sense. In common usage, it referred to worldly matters. The traditional definition of secularism is the neutrality of government and all public services in matters relating to one or more religions. Means that the state is neutral. All right? The term secularism, in its semantic journey, has grown in association with ideas of modernity, humanism, rationalism, and democracy. And throughout its journey, it has acquired diverse meanings in this process. It is significant that the trajectory of this semantic journey also differs from country to country and culture to culture. So with these introductory words, I would like to invite both scholars to discuss and debate on this interesting topic on political Islam versus secularism. And with this, I would like to hand over the first session to Dr. Nadia Hashimi to present his case. Thank you.
Can I take this down and just put it on the floor? Okay, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Let me begin by thanking everyone for coming to this symposium. Let me thank Dr. Farouk for inviting me to Malaysia. This is actually my first trip to Malaysia, hopefully not my last trip. I've been long fascinated by Malaysia. When I was a student living in Canada in the late 1990s, very much interested in questions of justice, of democracy, of human rights, and of course how these principles play out in the Islamic world. Malaysia seemed at that time to offer a lot of hope. This was way before the Arab Spring. This was way before the democratic transitions in Indonesia and in Turkey. And Malaysia seemed to be doing many things right. Now, we don't hear much about Malaysia anymore with respect to the question of democracy and Islam. I understand there's a unique experience here, and one of the reasons I'm here is to really understand sort of what is happening in Malaysia, where things have gone wrong, where things are right, and I'm looking forward to talking to many people over the course of the next 2 days. In my remarks today, I want to do 3 things. I want to define what secularism actually means. I want to provide a brief history of the concept, and then I want to discuss the relationship between secularism and democracy. And I want to do all of that in approximately 30 minutes. Now, secularism is inherently an ambiguous concept. It's also inherently a deeply emotionally charged concept. There's no global consensus on what the term actually refers to, where its origins lie, and its various dimensions, particularly in relationship to key political questions. Thus, an immediate problem that one encounters in discussing the topic of secularism is agreeing on a working definition of the term. What does secularism actually mean? What values does it promote, and what problems does it seek to resolve? Does secularism imply anti-clericalism, atheism, disestablishment, state neutrality, the rejection of all religious symbols in the public sphere, the separation of the public and private spheres, the complete separation of religion and politics, or more narrowly, simply the separation of the institutions of the state from the domination of religious forces in society? Next slide. Actually, could you go back to the previous slide? There. Now, one simple way of enhancing clarity about secularism is to think about the concept in relationship to the 3 sort of core disciplines within the social sciences: philosophy, sociology, and political science. Philosophically speaking, secularism refers to the rejection of the transcendental, the metaphysical, with a focus on the here and the now, the existential and the empirical. This is what the famous scholar Harvey Cox talked about in his 1996 book, The Secular City, where he discussed secularism as, quote, the liberation of man from religious and metaphysical tutelage, the turning of his attention away from other worlds towards this one. The other definition of secularism is a sociological definition of secularism, and it correlates with the process of modernization in terms of a gradual process that leads to the declining influence of religion in social institutions, communal life, and human relationships. This is arguably the most common understanding of secularism, and it's associated with what the prominent sociologist Peter Berger called in his book, The Sacred Canopy, a process by which sectors of society and culture are removed from the domination of religious institutions and symbols. There's a third conception of secularism called political secularism. And political secularism entails a separation of the public and the private spheres, and more broadly, a form of separation which can vary between the institutions of the state and the forces of religion in society. Now, this threefold breakdown of secularism is one that you'll often see in prominent scholarly analyses and discussions of secularism by leading thinkers such as Charles Taylor, Jose Casanova, Nikki Keddie, etc. And in trying to understand how the concept of secularism actually operates, it's important to realize that these 3 categories are not mutually exclusive. For example, one can be philosophically very religious, very non-secular, in the sense that one's moral reference and basic guidelines in life are derived from religion or metaphysical sources, this same person can live a life that is very sociologically religious. In other words, sociologically non-secular, in the sense that one spends most of his or her time in social institutions and relationships that are heavily defined and infused by religious references and symbols, yet simultaneously this third person can be politically secular, where they support the separation of religion and state because it leads to a more just society. One prominent example of such a person would be Mahatma Gandhi, someone who was deeply religious, lived in a very religious society, but politically supported, a form of Indian secularism. In the United States, the figure of Martin Luther King Jr. would also be considered someone who was very philosophically religious, sociologically spent time in churches, but politically supported a certain separation between religion and state. And I want to focus the rest of my remarks here on this third definition of secularism, the political understanding of secularism, or political secularism. Next slide. Now, the history of political secularism really goes back to Europe. It has deep European roots. It emerged in response to the problem of religion in political life in early medieval Europe. In the case of the Anglo-American tradition, the key paradigmatic event, the key turning point that really gave shape to political secularism was the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century and the ensuing wars of religion. A key political question during this time revolved around the relationship between religious toleration and political order. It was widely believed at the time that the two were incompatible, and that the establishment of a state religion, of the union between church and state, was the best way of preserving political stability in society. And so if you read all the classic sort of works, Thomas Hobbes, early John Locke, all of them believed that you had to have one institutionalized version of religion in society, else you would get chaos and mayhem ensuing. But around the late 17th century, I consider the figure of John Locke to be seminal. He rethought this entire relationship, and he thought that actually, religion and political order could coexist, provided that there was a certain separation between religion and state. And in his famous sort of, little book called A Letter Concerning Toleration, he argued that I esteem it above all things necessary to distinguish between the business of government and that of religion, and to settle the just bounds that lie between the one and the other. If this is not done, he said, there can be no end to the controversies that will always be arising between those that have or pretend to have on one side concern for the interest of men's souls, and on the other side concern and interest for care of the commonwealth. Now, the French Revolution was a key development in the history of secularism. It's a different historical sort of pathway towards secularism that comes out of the West. The tension between Paris and Rome was central to this particular development of secularism. It really was deeply connected to the role and behavior of the Catholic Church in French society, and a different understanding of secularism, known as laïcité, emerges that has decidedly anti-clerical and an anti-religious component to secularism. So these two distinct models of Western secularism produced different models of political secularism that have been passed down to societies around the world. The Anglo-American version of secularism tends to be less hostile toward the role of religion in public life. It does support a separation between the institutions of the state and the institutions of society, but the French model is much more draconian, much more anti-religious, and it calls for the removing and the marginalization of all religious symbols in the public sphere. Now, each of these different models of political secularism have their own historical experiences. Post-colonial Muslim societies that have been influenced by French secularism, such as the North African states and Turkey, have imported this type of hostility toward religion in the early formation of these post-colonial states. Next slide. Now, with respect to the question of Islam and Muslim societies, Islam has been viewed for a very long time as a religious tradition that is uniquely anti-secular. And what's interesting, if you look at some of the prominent sort of scholars in the Western social science tradition, they long argued that Islam is different than other societies and other religions in the world. In one very famous argument, the scholar Bernard Lewis wrote that the reasons why Muslims developed no secular movement of their own and reacted sharply against the introduction of one from abroad will thus be clear from the different contrasts between Christian and Muslim history and experience. From the beginning, he said, Christians were taught both by precept and practice to distinguish between God and Caesar, between the different duties owed to the two. Muslims, he said, received no such instruction. The prominent sort of scholar of the Clash of Civilizations thesis, Samuel Huntington, offered a similar interpretation of Islam and secularism, as did other people. I don't want to go into the details of what they said, but the point really here is that there's a lot of people within the Western social science tradition, many of them who had very hostile and antagonistic views toward Muslim societies, argued that, look, you know, one of the problems with Muslim societies and the development of modernity is that these societies just cannot be modern because they cannot come to terms with a modern understanding of political secularism. Now, what's interesting is that the ideas of these generally hostile Western scholars overlapped with the views of many politically active Muslim groups in the 20th century, who similarly rejected any separation between deen wa dola, between religion and government, in terms of their normative understandings of political order. There's also, you know, at a deeper level, this doctrine of tawhid within Islam that sort of, you know, discusses and suggests that everything is connected in the Islamic faith, that you can't separate, you know, the realm of religion from politics. And at one level, that's absolutely true. I would say that's not just a Muslim sort of belief, but it's also a Christian and Jewish and the belief of many sort of traditional religions, that we live in an all-encompassing, intertwined sort of world, and you can't simply sort of deposit your religious values and, you know, views at the door when you enter parliament or public life, that they're all deeply connected. That's all true. I don't dispute that. But more importantly, with respect to the history of secularism in the Muslim world, the latter half of the 20th century gave rise to a number of religious opposition movements that were deeply hostile to the secular national regimes that came into being after the end of colonialism. And this was a key development because many of these politically active Islamist movements who rejected the post-colonial world order did so in the name of rejecting the ideology that shaped these post-colonial states, which was often some form of secular nationalism. So that's a point I want to get to in a moment. But, you know, with respect to this history of secularism, you often hear that there's no equivalent translation in any of the key languages of the Islamic world for the word secularism, in Arabic, in Turkish, or in Persian. In Arabic, the common term for secularism is ilmaniya, coming from the word ilm, or science, or almaniya, coming from this worldly concepts of, you know, political life. In Persian, they've adapted the English word secularism and they pronounce it secularisme. And similarly in Turkish, they use the French adaptation laïque from the French laïcité. Now, one of the problems in terms of the history of secularism within the Muslim world came from the early translation of the term secularism. And this came from the writings and the speeches of Jamaluddin al-Afghani, the prominent late 19th century political activist who engaged at that time in a very famous debate on religion and science with the French philosopher Ernst Renan. And given the stature of al-Afghani as being one of the founding fathers of modern Islamic political thought, he mistranslated the word secularism as dahra'in, a Quranic term used to refer to atheists or non-believers. And this led to an enduring misunderstanding, equating 19th century positivists and scientists, such as the French philosopher Renan, with 7th century opponents of the Prophet Muhammad, as Afghani did, effectively meant that secularism, right from the beginning, right from the very start when Muslims started to think about secularism, this gave the notion and the concept of secularism a decidedly anti-religious and unethical orientation, because it was believed right at the beginning that secularism was equated with anti-Islamic forces. It was tantamount to the rejection of religious faith and its attendant morality, traditions, and rules that should guide a believing Muslim. The problems with secularism in Muslim societies, however, is far greater than simply a mistranslation or an incorrect translation of a single word. They are rooted in the actual lived experiences of Muslim communities over the last 200 years. The most politically salient part of this lived experience has been the encounter between European and later American imperialism. This is how secularism was first introduced to the region in many ways. The 2001-2003 American invasion and occupation of Iraq and Afghanistan is just the latest chapter in a long series of interventions that has deeply shaped the political and moral context in which debates on modernization and secularism have taken place. As Muhammad Khalid Massoud has noted, quote, Muslim thinkers found it very difficult to understand new ideas like secularism in isolation from Christian Western colonial supremacy. A key difference in the experience of secularism in Europe and in the West versus how it emerged in the Muslim world was that in the former, in the West, in Europe, secularism was an indigenous and gradual process that evolved and matured in conjunction with socioeconomic developments supported by intellectual arguments that eventually sank deep root in Europe's political culture. By contrast, the Muslim experience was much more rapid and has been marked by a perception of secularism as being an alien ideology imposed from the outside by invaders and then kept alive by post-colonial ruling elites who came to power after World War II. In short, secularism in Europe was largely a bottom-up process that was intimately connected to debates from within European civil society. While Muslim societies, by contrast, secularism was largely a top-down process that was driven first by the colonial state and then by the post-colonial state. As a result, secularism in the Muslim world has suffered from weak intellectual roots. And with few exceptions, I think Turkey is an exception, secularism really never penetrated the mainstream of Muslim societies. And of course, I'm talking here about political secularism, the idea that there should be some separation between religion and state. Now, most states in the Muslim world, by the end of the 20th century, were, broadly speaking, I mean, I'm not talking about Malaysia here, but I'm talking about the Arab and Islamic world. Most states within the Arab and Islamic world, by the end of the 20th century, were largely developmental failures. A pattern of state-society relations had developed that further impugned the reputation of secularism, because autocratic, modernizing post-colonial states, often with critical external support, ended up, over the course of the 20th century, suffocating civil society, forcing oppositional activity into the mosque, and thus inadvertently contributing to the rise of political Islam. A set of top-down, forced, draconian modernization and secularization policies by the post-colonial state within a short period of time started to develop widespread social and psychological alienation and dislocation. You had rapid urbanization taking place at this time, changing cultural and socioeconomic relationships were emerging, but also you had an enveloping context of corruption, economic mismanagement, rising poverty, income inequality, and all of this undermined the legitimacy of the post-colonial state. And these developments reflected badly on secularism because the ruling ideology of many of these post-colonial states in the Arab Islamic world were openly secular nationalist. Thus, for a generation of Muslims growing up in the post-colonial era, despotism, dictatorship, and human rights violations came to be associated with secularism. Muslim political activists who experienced oppression at the hands of a secular nationalist government logically concluded that secularism is an ideology of repression. This observation applies not only to Iran under the Shah, but also to Tunisia, Algeria, Egypt, Syria, Yemen, Turkey to a certain extent, and other Muslim-majority countries in the latter half of the 20th century. Just to cite one contemporary example, today the ruling regime in Damascus under the leadership of Bashar al-Assad openly, loudly, and consistently proclaims itself to be secular. At the same time, it is committing borderline genocidal activity against its own population, war crimes, state-sanctioned human rights violations, state-sanctioned crimes against humanity, have produced one of the worst humanitarian and moral crises of the 21st century. And this is a regime that claims to be secular. It's not difficult to understand why opposition to that particular repressive secular regime will then take on an anti-secular particular manifestation, and why many of the opposition rebel groups in Syria are religious-based, hostile to secularism, because the regime that is killing them and bombing them is openly secular. Now, summarizing this broad trend of the difficulties of secularism in the Arab Islamic world, the political scientist Vali Nas has written, quote, "Secularism in the Muslim world never really overcame its colonial origins, never lost its association with the post-colonial's continuous attempt to dominate society. Its fortunes became tied to those of the state. The more the state's ideology came into question, the more its actions alienated social forces, the more secularism was rejected in favor of more indigenous worldviews and social institutions, which for the most part were tied to Islam. As such, the decline of secularism was a reflection of the decline of the post-colonial state in the Muslim world." There's also a few other contributing factors with respect to secularism that I think have made this whole discussion of secularism in Muslim-majority societies very difficult and complex and emotionally charged. The fact that the West proudly proclaims itself as being secular, this is simultaneously viewed by Muslims as a problem, because there is a confrontation and tension between Islam and the West. The more the West proclaims itself as being secular, there's sort of a Muslim counter-reaction as a result. Overt Western support for dictatorial regimes in the Islamic world, such as in Egypt, in Tunisia before the revolution, and many other cases, sort of illustrate and add complexity to this problem. Western support, for example, to the Algerian military coup in the early 1990s, Western strong support for the State of Israel at the expense of the Palestinians, indirectly contributes to this erosion of any respect for secularism in Muslim societies, because the West, being the champion of secularism, is pursuing all of these unjust policies. So why would anyone want to gravitate to that form of a political system? Then you have this very famous case in France that some of you may know. It's taken on different forms. I mean, I come from Canada. There's a French-speaking majority province in Quebec where there have been these laws that are being passed in the name of secularism to ban Muslim women the right to free expression and to wear the hijab. And so this very famous case in France in the late 1990s resulted in 2004 in the passing of a new law in defense of secularism, because the French perceived that secularism was under threat by Muslim communities within their borders, and of course the perception of these debates in France and in Quebec by Muslim societies was that secularism was obviously inherently hostile and antagonistic to the basic civil rights of Muslim communities. So that's, I think, another complicating factor. Could you get to the next slide now? I want to sort of shift topic here and talk about why secularism, properly understood, political secularism, actually matters for the construction of democracy. What's the relationship? And in a very famous, I think, theoretical contribution, one that deeply shaped my own thinking, by Alfred Stepan, he developed this idea of the twin tolerations as a way of thinking about the relationship between religion and democracy, and as a way of moving away from any discussion and using the term secularism because it's such an emotionally charged term. And Alfred Stepan, in his thesis on religion and democracy, comes up with this term called the twin tolerations. Next slide. Now, the twin tolerations, according to Alfred Stepan, is the minimum boundaries of freedom of action that somehow must be developed for political institutions of the state in terms of how they relate to religious institutions in society, and conversely, how religious institutions and groups in society should view the state. That's what he means by the twin tolerations. In other words, the easy way of thinking about the twin tolerations is you have the state and its various institutions, you have society where you have religious groups, forces, political parties. These two sort of broad categories have to learn to both tolerate one another. They have to respect certain minimum boundaries in terms of how far they can go in projecting their own policies on the other, and both the religion and the state, the religion and the religious forces, or let's say the state forces and the religious forces in society have to somehow learn to strike that proper balance. That's really what the concept of the twin tolerations refers to. And so after sort of defining this sort of concept of religion-state relationships in the framing of the twin tolerations, Alfred Stepan asks the important question, what are the minimum core institutional political requirements that we need for democracy, and how does that relate to the role of religion in society? In other words, what type of minimum requirements does a functioning democracy need when religion is a factor in society? And he sort of offers the standard sort of obvious questions and requirements by stating that among sort of theorists of democracy, it's widely viewed that in order to have a functioning democracy, you needed to have 8 core conditions, 8 requirements that really revolve around the question of how do you have a free and fair election. You needed the freedom to organize and join organizations. You need to have freedom of expression, the right to vote. You had to have eligibility for public office, the right for political leaders to compete for votes and generate support for their political platforms. You needed alternative sources of information. You needed free and fair elections. And you needed institutions for making government policies that depend on the votes and that have the capacity to pursue policies. Those are sort of the standard definitions of democracy that are associated with what the famous democratic theorist Robert Dahl called polyarchy. And so Alfred Stepan says those are the things that you need to have a functioning democracy. You also need to have certain human rights and civil liberty guarantees so that democratically elected governments must rule within the framework of the law after an election has taken place. And then he goes on to sort of develop this thesis where he says that it's important to remember that democracy, all democracy, is really a system of conflict regulation that allows for the peaceful competition over values, goals, and policies. As long as individuals and groups agree to work within the framework of the law, to respect the rights of all citizens and all groups, then every group in civil society should be granted the opportunity to advance their political interests. According to Alfred Stepan, everyone has the right to have a say in public policy making that will affect their lives. This is really the minimum institutional statement of what a democratic polity needs and is required in order to sustain a democracy. Nothing more, nothing less. Everyone should have the say to participate in public life. So what does this actually mean with respect to the relationship between religion and democracy? And what are the necessary boundaries of freedom for elected governments that they should respect with respect to religious groups? And what are the necessary boundaries of freedom that religious groups need to respect with respect to their attitude toward the state? Alfred Stepan makes the following key argument: that religious institutions and religious groups in society should not have a constitutionally guaranteed privilege to dictate, limit, or veto decisions made by democratically elected governments. That's really central here. I think that's the core of his argument, that religious institutions and religious groups in society should not have a constitutionally guaranteed right to limit, veto, or dictate decisions that are made by democratically elected parliaments. And that's, if you think about it, really central to democracy because it speaks to who is sovereign. If you have a sovereign parliament, people are elected, you shouldn't allow any other group to veto those decisions that are made by a democratically elected parliament. Likewise, he says, religious groups should have complete autonomy to worship privately and to advance their public interests in the public sphere, to sponsor organizations and movements as long as they do so non-violently and without violating the liberties of others. No religious group can be excluded from participating in politics. It is only after a violation has occurred that you can perhaps put constraints on the behaviors of the state or the behavior of religious groups, and that can only be decided and should be decided by an independent judiciary. So casting his theoretical net very widely and broadly, Alfred Stepan comes to the conclusion that in light of this broad framework on the minimum freedom for a democratic state to exist and the minimum freedom that should be allowed for for citizens to exist, he says that it is apparent that from a theoretical perspective, there can be an extraordinarily broad range of patterns of religion-state relations that any political system can have in order to meet that minimum definition of democracy. What he's really saying here is that there's not one model for religion-state relations. There can be many different models as long as you stick to this core basic framework of the twin tolerations, as long as religious groups in society don't try and veto the decisions of democratically elected parliaments, and as long as the institutions of the states also recognize and respect the rights of religious groups in society. Next slide. And so Alfred Stepan, just getting to a conclusion here, turns to the case of Europe to provide us with some historical depth in terms of how religion-state relations have evolved over time. And he asked the question, how have religion-state relations in Europe developed in the backdrop of this concept of the twin tolerations that he uses? According to Stepan, he says that many Western social scientists, when discussing the question of democracy in non-Western societies, often have a very unhistorical or ahistorical approach to the subject. And they assume incorrectly that in order to have a democracy, you need to have a rigid separation between church and state. And he goes on to say that these Western social scientists are particularly insistent upon this when they apply their analytical lens to the Islamic world, because Western social scientists, intellectuals, and politicians tend to get very nervous whenever there are democratic elections that bring Islamist parties to power, and many Western intellectuals and politicians tend to have sympathy when the military intervenes to thwart a democratization process in the Muslim world, as we saw in Algeria in the early 1990s, as we saw in Turkey in 1996, and as we saw just last year in the context of Egypt. But Stepan asks the question, is this view that democracy requires a rigid separation between religion and state actually a factual reading of the history of democracy in Europe, or is it a distorted reading? And he goes on to provide the following empirical evidence. He looks at 15 European Union countries. At that time, the European Union, when he was writing, had 15 members. And he discovers, very remarkably, that as of the year 1990, 5 out of the 15 members of the European Union, Denmark, Finland, Greece, Sweden, and the United Kingdom, and Norway, had officially established churches and officially established religions in their constitutions. And he goes on to note that every long-standing Western European democracy that had a strong Lutheran Protestant majority, Sweden, Denmark, Iceland, Finland, and Norway, had an established church. And then he draws our attention to these articles of the Norwegian constitution that sort of are very baffling for many people who think they know what they're talking about when it comes to religion-state relations. Article 2 of their Norwegian constitution: the evangelical religion shall remain the official religion of the state. The inhabitants professing it are bound to bring up their children in the same. Article 12, half of the members of the king's council shall profess the official religion. Article 21, the king, after consultation with his council of ministers, can appoint senior religious officials. Similarly, if you look at the official website of the British monarchy, it continues to contain very strict religious guidelines that says that a Roman Catholic is specifically excluded from becoming a future head of state of England, and that the sovereign king of England must be a member of the Church of England and must swear to uphold the Church of England in terms of his teaching and beliefs. In a similar vein, if you look at the Greek constitution, it declares, quote, that, quote, the prevailing religion in Greece is that of the East Eastern Orthodox Church of Christ. Article 14 states that it is an insult to Christians in Greece to insult Christianity and other known religions. Similarly, Article 16 of the Spanish Constitution reads, quote, "The public powers shall take into consideration the religious beliefs of Spanish society and maintain the appropriate relations and cooperation with the Catholic Church and other religious denominations." Now, this is a mere sampling of a general European pattern. In the Netherlands, in Austria, and in Germany, there also exists extensive state support for private religious education. Christian democratic parties have frequently ruled in Germany, Austria, Italy, Belgium, and the Netherlands. The only EU member whose constitution explicitly prohibits political parties from using religious symbols, interestingly, is Portugal. Now, summarizing his thesis on the relationship between religion and democracy, next slide, Alfred Stepan comes to the following conclusion. Virtually no Western European democracy now has a rigid or hostile separation of church and state. Indeed, most have arrived at a democratically negotiated freedom of religion from state interference, and all of these European countries allow religious groups freedom not only to private worship, but also to organize in civil society. The lesson from Western Europe, Alfred Stepan says, lies not in religion-state separation, but in the constant political construction and reconstruction of the twin tolerations. Indeed, it is only in the context of the twin tolerations that the concept of the separation of church and state really has a place in the modern vocabulary of Western European democracy. Last slide. So the conclusion here that I want to sort of really summarize for you in terms of thinking about secularism, particularly its political manifestation, is that, number one, secularism is inherently an ambiguous term. Even when we sort of talk about political secularism, the relationship between religion and politics, there is a number of many different models of political secularism or of religion-state relationships that democracy can entertain and withhold. That's largely a byproduct of the fact that there are many different political histories. The history of Anglo-American secularism is very different than the French experience. In the non-Western world, we also have different political histories of religion-state relations and different political histories of what I would call third world secularism. One of the most interesting examples of, I would argue, a very successful non-Western form of secularism is the Indian example. India, until fairly recently, was the one country that produced some of the most intense debates, scholarly literatures, and production on the question of secularism. You also have, as was mentioned by the previous speaker, a very successful Indonesian model of secularism. You also have in Africa a Muslim-majority country by the name of Senegal that has, I would argue, a successful model of religion-state separation that has allowed for democracy to advance. And so Alfred Stepan sort of makes an important contribution that I think are valuable to societies such as Indonesia to really think about, that political secularism needs to be constantly crafted, negotiated, bargained by members of a political society. And he sort of indirectly is suggesting here that we can disperse with this emotionally charged term of secularism, what I call the dirty S word. The dirty S word has a legacy. It's emotionally charged. Many Muslims consider it to be synonymous with or equivalent with atheism, with the absence of moral values. I think that the project of democracy can actually be enhanced in many societies that have Muslim populations by dispersing and not using the word secularism, and instead looking at what Alfred Stepan was really talking about. What are the core political requirements that a functioning democracy needs in order to coexist with religious forces in society? How can we sort of properly negotiate the important political values and principles that allows for democracy to sustain itself and also recognizes the important role that religious groups can play in political society. That's really, I think, the best way forward in terms of advancing a just society, in terms of thinking about this very emotionally charged and difficult subject of secularism or the proper relationship between religion and state. I think there's a lot of room for coming up with unique and different models of religion-state separation that can accommodate the different cultural and historical experiences of countries around the world. And I'm hoping that Malaysia, in the course of your own democratic experience here, can come up with a unique model that will allow democracy to flourish, human rights to flourish, while at the same time recognizing the important right of religious groups to have their identities and their values part of the political experience that can contribute to the creation of a more just and better society. I've gone over my time. My apologies. Thank you for your attention.